Hello, and welcome to State of the Economy, a show that connects you with key policymakers and thinkers. Today we have with us a special guest who left the rarefied world of global diplomacy to take the plunge into electoral politics and indeed won an election from Kerala, Trivandrum to be precise, with a huge margin. Welcome to our show, Mr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Venu.
Now, as a practitioner of foreign policy for all these decades, there's a question that comes to mind. How do you link the needs of 21st century India as a rising economic story with the changes that we need to bring about in our foreign policy, in our attitudes, which is also the theme of your the latest book, Pax Indica. Could you just give us a view?
Sure. And first of all, I mean, I passionately believe, and I believe the Prime Minister believes it, that the entire purpose of our foreign policy has to be to promote the domestic transformation of our own country, our own society, development of our people. And that means that our foreign policy should be geared towards essentially promoting the security and the well-being of the Indians. That's what our policy is about. It should not be excessively focused on doctrine or principle or moralistic understandings of other countries' business. It ought to be what will help us to overcome our economic and political challenges, our development, put our people out of poverty.
And which means the material well-being of our people.
Our people. So a lot of our policy, for example, we need good relations with countries that will be sources of investment for us. We need good relations with countries that will be important trading partners. We have no energy resources of our own, so we need good relations with countries that are sources of our energy security. Increasingly, as the import of food becomes a factor, food security will become a factor, and so on. So it's a materialist view, but it's a materialist view that is anchored very much in our country's democracy. We have to do things that benefit our people. And in that spirit, I mean, I've written this book very much hoping, and it's a book for lay people, it's not a book for scholars or academics. It is a book in which I'm trying to explain to the ordinary thinking, educated person in this country why foreign policy matters to them. And because it matters to them, and particularly to this younger generation living in a far more globalized India than the one in which I was born, I would say that we're looking at a country where certainly foreign policy is going to be an extremely important determinant of some of our economic policies.
In a way, you're suggesting that in a globalized world, as India is also integrating with the rest of the world economically, foreign policy becomes an issue which actually touches your skin in a material sense, right?
Exactly.
And you just told me that China, for instance, follows a very materialistic foreign policy and has, to a fair extent, succeeded in doing so, right?
It has, but their style is very different from ours, and I would not advocate that we follow their approach. They have, with single-minded determination, definitely pursued all these things that I've mentioned. We also
they're very good at getting oil fields and energy assets abroad, food.
But they've tended to go in with a very heavy governmental footprint. In Africa, for example, they practically bought up certain governments. They've built major infrastructure projects like roads and railways and buildings, but they've even sent Chinese prison labor over to do the work. So it has become something that, frankly, we should not do, because what we have got in our country is a very different approach, a light footprint, a tendency, for example, to use our private sector to do some of these projects rather than having a heavy governmental presence. In Africa, we often use African labor, even train African managers. We leave behind better, improved human resources. We come in with things like IT technology and train them in something that they need to have. So we are, I think, doing it very differently from China, but I think we are winning more hearts and minds in the process. So I wouldn't use China as a comparator particularly.
Yeah, sure. I understand your point. But are you satisfied that with the engagement that we have or are building with the rest of the world, does it require a much bigger kind of push rather than what you see it as? Right
Well,
now?
it certainly requires more resources than we have currently given our Ministry of External Affairs. It seems to me quite shocking that we have just 800 odd diplomats in our foreign service.
Yeah, there's a chapter in your book which talks about that.
The Chinese are 4,200. I mean, you know, the Brazilians have 1,200, and there are.
Yeah, I'm told Singaporeans have more diplomats than we have. Mr. Karan Singh was saying that in your panel discussion.
867 is what Singapore has. So we're looking at a situation where clearly in terms of what we expect them to do, we punch well below our weight. So we need more resources, we need more staff, we also need to train them better, we need to give them more language skills, we need to have a posting and promotions policy that aligns these skills to these needs, and frankly we also need to get some more specialists into our system. Something like climate change negotiations are so specialized and technical, we need people trained in that area. Or let's say you want to...
World Trade Organization,
trade negotiations. Or you want to open more of a presence in Latin America, you need more Spanish speakers, and so on and so forth. And that's something which got a certain amount of attention when I advocated seriously that we should go in for mid-career recruitment of experienced people who have skills that the Foreign Ministry currently needs. And frankly is not doing enough to get.
Did you make the suggestion when you were Minister of State for External Affairs?
Well, I was still too new. Some of these things I did gradually begin to get involved in myself. But in our allocation of responsibilities, the administrative side was not under me. When I left, however, I was put on the Standing Committee on External Affairs, which is looking at these issues, and I was certainly able to get the Standing Committee to strongly endorse this suggestion that we should bring in more expertise and more resources into the Foreign Ministry.
You just told me that you received some feedback from IFS officers that they are probably open to this idea.
I think a lot of the younger ones are quite open and receptive to this, but some of the older ones who've actually gone through the system and like the system they have or that shaped them tend to be more resistant. And one of the reasons for the resistance is they have the strong view of the purity of the Foreign Service, which they feel would be diluted if we were to bring in people from the outside that who have not passed the exam and not gone through the mill. But there are ways you can deal with that. You can bring in the experts for particular purposes on finite contracts, say a 5-year contract or something like that, and then see how they work out. You can train them. They can then go through a selection process at the end of those 5 years, whether they may or may not be retained by the Foreign Service. There are ways this could be done, but we are far from doing it at the moment.
Do you feel, Shashi, that currently the way our Foreign Service is structured, the way their attitudes are structured, are they enough oriented towards material progress or material well-being of our population like the US or Chinese diplomats would be? I mean, like doing business, let's go and do business.
They've become much more like that. In the past, it was not so. In the 60s and 70s, you ask an Indian ambassador to consort with a businessman or a business issue, he would have been horrified.
So has that attitude shift happened?
That has changed. Right now, starting at the ministerial level, it's very clear that ministers are expected to take business delegations with them when they travel to foreign countries, that when they get there, they are dealing with an ambassador who himself or herself has been sensitized to the important challenge of promoting trade and business relations. This has now become part of the DNA of the Indian ambassador, and that's a major change in the last few decades, and one that's very healthy. We need this.
We will come back and discuss this in greater detail, but after a small break, please don't go away and keep watching Rajya Sabha television. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Mr. Shashi Tharoor. We were talking about the orientation of our foreign policy diplomats, bureaucrats. Now, Mr. Tharoor, India is changing. The Indian diaspora is huge today. It's multiple times what probably it used to be 20 years ago. Indian individuals are going abroad, seamlessly moving out, providing services, coming back. So to that extent, do you feel that we need to reorient the way foreign policy establishment works to actually to cater to the needs and aspirations of this population, which is now part of the global marketplace? Now, I know you said it's happening, but is it happening enough? That's a question that we keep getting asked.
What's happening enough? Whether we've reoriented ourselves sufficiently to the global.
Whether we are helping in some ways, we are aiding this whole mass of people, service providers, individuals, technical service providers who keep going out. And that's a big part of our globalization story. Indians going out and that's what brings us about $80 billion a year, which is much more than our annual foreign direct investment, so-called, from big companies abroad. Now, are we doing enough for them? Are we doing enough for Indian workers abroad?
It's a very fair question, and I must say that from my limited experience of 11 months as a minister, I would say yes, but we could always do more. In other words, I, for example, when I traveled to the Gulf countries, always made it a point to meet with expatriate Indian workers, see what their problems were, then try and see the appropriate minister, who was often not the foreign minister, but the labor minister in the country concerned, to raise these issues. And I was able to do that quite systematically on my trips. I suspect that other ministers are doing similar things, but equally important to us has got to be that we frankly make more of this. We now have a Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs whose principal responsibility this is, and I certainly hope they will take this forward and further.
Yeah. Now, coming back to, we've spoken about the strength of our foreign policy establishment. You said we need to increase the number of people that we have to cater to the needs of 21st century India, the rising India economic story that India is. Now, in terms of mindset, has there been enough of a shift? Because I find that we are still a bit mealy-mouthed about what is our strategic autonomy. Now, there's a lot of confusion as to whether are we engaging enough with the US, or are we engaging enough with China, or are we tending to fall between two stools? How do you look at this?
Well, I think it's a fair question. I mean, there's no question in my mind that strategic autonomy should be a springboard rather than a straitjacket. That is, it should not be that we are constantly hemmed in by terms we have strung around our own necks, but rather that we should use this to explore our own needs and pursue our own interests. When I look at India's approach, essentially there's a wonderful apocryphal story I've told in the book of John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State in the 50s, saying to Nehruji, are you with us or against us? And in the story, Nehruji answers, yes, which means, yes, I'm with you, and yes, I'm against you. It depends on the issue and how I feel about it. And that has essentially been the nugget that encapsulates
there's a dialectics to that.
India's strategic autonomy, that we want to have the right to take our own decisions. After 200 years of another country taking decisions for us in world affairs, we decided we wanted to do it for ourselves. But at the same time, this cannot be sort of an inflexible neutrality, and it's not. It's an engagement with the world. There will be issues in which we will agree with certain countries without becoming their allies. We can be partners with them. And there are issues in which we will disagree with the same countries and make common cause with others. It seems to me the rich complexity of our relationships are that whereas we still have an unresolved frontier dispute with China, for example, which is potentially serious because it could at any time, in theory, erupt into conflict.
Especially considering that they have resolved their disputes with other countries.
With other land, all the other land disputes have been resolved except with us. But despite that, we have managed to let trade grow to such a level, over $60 billion last year, that we may actually end up in a position where China has too much of a stake in the Indian economy to be able to risk any military adventure. So you're looking at a situation where trade itself can become a determinant of geopolitics. And I would see something similar happening one day with Pakistan, where we have practically no trade worth the name, but there is a serious move afoot to liberalize trade between our two countries. If that happens, one of the problems right now has been that there is a sort of constituency within the Pakistani establishment that thrives on hostility with India, because it helps them justify their own dominance of Pakistani resources in the Pakistani state. But the problem is they've had no countervailing pressure. If the military or the ISI or whatever want to foment trouble, want to do a Kargil or whatever, the peace constituency in Pakistan is very weak. But imagine if you're suddenly finding a Pakistan doing $25–30 billion of trade with India.
Sure.
There will be a whole lot of Pakistani businessmen, powerful members of their establishment, who will say nothing doing. We don't want a military adventure. We don't want to jeopardize all of this.
Indeed,
That could become an advantage.
Indeed, you're right. In fact, a research paper I recently read shows that a direct free trade between India and Pakistan actually has a potential of about $20–25 billion.
Yeah.
So here again, as you said, for China, trade could become the driver of bringing these societies much closer to each other?
Absolutely.
And do you think the recent, the big breakthrough that happened in trade with Pakistan, where we just have a very small negative list, rest is all, and also that could pave the way eventually for a larger South Asia free trade zone.
That was very much the idea. You remember?
Eventually, a European Union kind of situation. I'm not saying a single currency yet, but do you think that's a possibility over a 10-year?
I would say a free trade zone, though it'll be defined, I'm sure, with some riders, is a distinct possibility. I don't know when we'll get to the European Union level where there is complete free trade between all these areas. We, after all, are a state where till recently there was still octroi between states, and there are still...
I know, there are some people say within India we're not as free as we think we are.
Exactly. So given that, I'm not sure that we should immediately expect the best. And some countries will want to protect some of their industries. There's no question there'll be some industries in Pakistan, Bangladesh and so on which would fear being swamped by much larger Indian competition. But I would say that the notion of a South Asian free trade area, which we've been bruiting about in SAARC for some time, was only held up by Pakistani intransigence. The Bangladeshis were very keen. We were keen. The Sri Lankans were...
The rest are already on board, yeah.
So if we can get the Pakistanis to change their thinking, I think a SAFTA is very much on the cards.
Now, we will discuss more of this, but after a break, please don't go away and keep watching Raj Sabha television. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Mr. Shashi Tharoor. Mr. Tharoor, another interesting line that I liked in your book was how you pose the 4 C's which should govern our foreign policy in the 21st century. Compete, cooperate, confront and conflict. Now, this is classic dialectics. So you actually feel that these 4 could go parallelly, whether it's our relationship with China or with US or with...
Well, no, I personally would like to avoid conflict. I feel that given our focus, as I've described it earlier, on our own domestic growth and development, investors don't come into war zones. So if we get embroiled in conflict, then I think we'll be doing ourselves a disservice, whether with China or with Pakistan. I think in my Pakistan chapter, for example, I argue a very strong realistic case, a realist case for peace with Pakistan. I'm not a hawk because I don't believe any military solution is possible, but I'm not a dove either. I'm not one of the candlelight holding people at Wagah border. I'm a dove who's been mugged by reality, and we've seen that Vajpayeeji's bus yatra was rewarded with Kargil. Manmohanji's talks with Musharraf and then with Zardari were followed by 2611. We know that in Pakistan there are elements that really wish to promote conflict with us. But it's not in our interest to have it because we don't want the albatross of Pakistani hostility around our necks to hobble us as we march forward in our own economic growth. So that's my argument. We need essentially peace with Pakistan in our own interest, in India's own interest. And that's the basis for suggesting that conflict is a bad idea. Cooperation, coexistence, occasional diplomatic confrontation, these are all various sort of arrows on the quiver we'll have to use.
No, I fully agree with your sentiment, but can you avoid conflict in certain situations? For instance, as I see the global economy evolving, energy needs are huge. Therefore, China is doing a lot to create tensions in the South China Sea area, even in the way Indian Ocean will be militarized going forward. And again, from an economic perspective, because these are all energy routes. Now, if tomorrow there were some sort of conflict between confrontation between US and China in the seas, the Pacific, don't you think we'll get drawn into the whole thing willy-nilly?
Maybe not, because the South China Sea is still a bit far from our shores and we don't have a credible military or naval presence in that area. The Indian Ocean between us and Africa is a different matter. There we have a direct deployment and we also frankly have an interest in keeping open the sea lanes of communication because they bring our trade to our country, including our energy supplies. However, in my view, that's an area where we could actually make common cause with the Chinese. They have the same interest in keeping open the sea lanes of communication between the energy-producing countries of the Gulf, the food-producing countries of Africa, and their country, which has to pass by India. So we could well imagine an area of cooperation and more than coexistence, actual cooperation in patrolling together in certain areas,
seas.
dividing up the seas, keeping open those sea lanes. The South China Sea, we don't have the strength yet or the reach yet to make enough of a difference to them for good or for ill. But I think on this side, across the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, we should actually seriously think in terms of cooperation with the Chinese.
So cooperation in terms of what? Can you flesh out it?
Well, for example, let's say that the Somali pirate threat has become a serious issue. We could easily work out joint patrolling arrangements with the Chinese, where they take certain sectors of the waters, we take certain other sectors. They will escort our ships and theirs as well, we'll escort their ships and ours as well, whatever. In other words, sharing the burden because we both agree we both have a common interest. That sort of thing is what I
So do you think we could do joint patrolling with China as well as with the US? In some parts of the seas with the US, in some parts of the...
The US, the French, the Brits are all in those waters. We have not chosen so far to join their task force. But I don't see any reason why there can't be mutual understanding. If you're doing this area, then please help our ships also. We're doing this area if you like, and whatever. This kind of cooperation is entirely possible.
This brings me to another question, Mr. Tharoor. Again, I'm coming back to whether our old foreign policy attitude, is it changing at all? In the sense, for instance, the Americans are not very happy at the way post-nuclear deal things are turning out, and also post the India-US strategic partnership, which was signed when Obama was here, things are panning out. For instance, in defense, they are expecting a lot in terms of cooperation, in terms of doing deals, striking joint ventures. India also privatizing a bit of its defense. Now, isn't that part of the change that foreign policy and indeed domestic policy also should look at, or are you satisfied with the pace of change there?
No, I think you're right. There's not been enough change, and we do need a credible injection of the private sector into our policy making, whether it's coming into the defense industry so we don't have to rely totally on imports, whether it's coming into foreign relations. For example, the Adi Godrej-led delegation to Pakistan did a tremendous job in helping promote a thaw with members of the business establishment in that country. We have FICCI and CII leading delegations or running delegations of top-notch investors and business people to foreign countries. So we can see the private sector playing a role in our thinking, and that again is a welcome change from the past. But again, a lot more can be done.
Are we still? Do you feel we are still stuck in incrementalism? I mean, okay, nuclear deal was a big
leap forward.
But barring that, do you feel that we are still informed by incrementalism in our foreign policy? Sometimes people make a virtue of incrementalism also.
To some degree, it's unavoidable, Venu, because you're looking at a series of verities in our foreign policy that have been laid down for a long time, and changes have to be gradual. But if you really look at what's happened since the early 90s, we have invented a number of fundamental changes. The whole Lukis policy, very different from our attitude to ASEAN in the past. The whole opening with Israel and the upgrading of relations with Israel, again impossible before 1991. Our definite tilt in terms of trade relationship with China, which again was practically non-existent 20 years ago. Our much more overt cultivation of the United States. Again, in the non-line days, that was not there, it was quite difficult. I would suggest that there have been more than incremental changes in at least these areas, and one could add to that the rediscovery of Africa. We had an Africa policy based on anti-colonial rhetoric and so on. Now a very different...
Now it's also more business-oriented.
Business and development partnership. And now our newly incipient discovery of Latin America. So I would say that we are doing well. More can be done, the pace can be accelerated, the substance can be greater. But we've started off in all these areas on the right track.
So what do you think could be the next big move, non-incremental, like a kind of non-linear kind of move that could, according to you, could really lift our foreign policy to the next big level of engagement which your book talks about?
Well, it's difficult to predict because so many things happen. In our own neighborhood, definitely strengthening the institutions of SAARC, creating a South Asian free trade area. SAFTA would be a terrific step forward. And linked to that, much more liberalized visa regime with Pakistan, much more exchange of cultural products and so on. That too, people-to-people contact and business-to-business contact will transform our relationship with Pakistan, otherwise it won't. With the US, I suspect that there is no big ticket change possible beyond what we already have. but increasing the momentum of our current very warm and friendly contact. Europe has been largely neglected, and they've neglected us as well. That's an area where we could certainly explore some major new cooperation, and a free trade agreement with Europe, which has been negotiated.
Yeah, we've done a free trade with Japan, both goods and services. Europe is being negotiated. What about America? Do you think time is ripe for a free trade agreement with in goods and services with the US, which was something which Mr. Anand Sharma had proposed when Obama was here? In fact, it was surprising that the US was a bit diffident. Probably because of the local domestic economics.
They're exactly right. I think there the resistance is not from our side for a change, but from theirs. They seem to be worried about being swamped by Indian outsourcing services and other services that will take jobs away from America, and politically that will be a loser for them.
Okay, and what about ideas like a brick bank, a brick financial architecture? Does a South-South cooperation in an open market-oriented kind of architecture appeal to you?
Yes, why not? I mean, these are new ideas. They'll have to be fleshed out. We have to see how it works. Not every development bank has been strong enough to make an actual impact.
But I'm told the US is very unhappy. Whenever such an initiative is taken, the US becomes, it develops a certain aversion to such South-South.
I am sure that's true, and equally, I think we have a strong argument that until they democratize the existing institutions of world order, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, the Bretton Woods institutions, it's very difficult for them to resist or to object to us creating our own to balance institutions in which we don't have a voice commensurate with our size, our ability, and our need.
But do you think these institutions will democratize in the next 10 years?
We're working on it. As you know, we've already seen a slight shift after the Pittsburgh G8 summit, G20 summit.
Yeah, sure.
We've seen a slight shift in voting power in both the bank and the IMF, but very slight. We need to carry on that process and increase it until there's at least parity between the developed world on the one hand and the developing and transition economies on the other. And I think India is one of those countries that's pushing very strongly there.
Yeah. Let's hope this process gathers pace. Thanks a lot for talking to us, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back again soon. Goodbye.